I never thought I'd be writing this. Even now, sitting here, trying to put this into words, my hands are trembling. I don't know what to believe anymore. I don't even know if what I saw was real or if my mind is playing tricks on me. But I swear, every single detail of what I'm about to tell you happened. It started when my grandfather passed away last summer. He was a quiet man, someone who kept to himself. Even when I was a kid, he wasn't the type to play games with me or tell me bedtime stories. He always seemed distant, like he was carrying some kind of weight that none of us could see. My dad told me that Grandpa had been that way ever since he was young. Something happened to him when he was in his 20s, but no one in the family ever knew what. When he died, my dad and I were the ones left to clean out his house. It was an old place, sitting on the edge of a small town, one of those homes that creaked at night, where the floorboards always felt cold no matter the season. I hadn't visited much over the past few years, but stepping inside again after all this time, I felt an overwhelming sense of something, like the house itself was watching me. It took us a few days to go through his things. Most of it was just old clothes, dusty books, and furniture that hadn't been moved in decades. But then we found the basement. I say found because, for as long as I could remember, that door had always been locked. My dad told me Grandpa never let anyone go down there. He never explained why, just made it clear that no one was allowed inside. Now with Grandpa gone, there was no reason to keep it shut. The door was old and heavy, and it took some effort to get it open. When we finally stepped inside, a wave of musty air hit me. The basement was nothing special, just a dimly lit space filled with boxes, old tools, and a workbench covered in dust. But there was one thing that stood out, a small wooden chest sitting in the farthest corner of the room. It was locked. Unlike everything else in the basement, this chest wasn't covered in dust. It looked like someone had been opening and closing it recently. I glanced at my dad, who only shrugged before reaching down and trying to pry it open. When that didn't work, he left to find something to break the lock. But I didn't wait. Something about that chest made my skin crawl. My heart pounded as I ran my fingers along its edges, feeling for a weakness in the wood. And then, just as my dad stepped back inside with a crowbar, I heard a click. The lock popped open on its own. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Dad must have thought I had done it because he didn't say anything, just gestured for me to open it. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside there was only one thing, a VHS tape, no label, no markings, just a black cassette sitting in the middle of the chest, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt wrong, like it was heavier than it should have been. I glanced at my dad, but he just shook his head. Weird, he muttered. Probably just some old home video. We didn't have a VHS player at home, but Grandpa's house did. An old, dusty one sat on a shelf in the living room, hooked up to a tiny TV that barely worked. My dad didn't care to watch it. He was more focused on finishing the cleanup, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this tape was important. So I waited until that night. When my dad went to bed, I grabbed the tape, slid it into the player, and hit play. At first, there was only static. Then, the screen flickered, and I saw something I will never be able to forget. A dimly lit room, small and cramped, with walls made of concrete. There was a single chair in the center, facing the camera, and sitting in that chair was my grandfather. But he looked different. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. His hands were tied to the arms of the chair, and his mouth was covered with duct tape. He was struggling, shaking his head violently as if trying to break free. And then someone stepped into the frame, a figure dressed in black, their face obscured by a mask. I felt my stomach turn. My grandfather was trying to scream, his muffled cries barely audible over the static noise in the background. The masked figure didn't say anything. They just reached into their pocket, pulled out a knife, and slowly walked towards my grandfather. And then, the tape cut to black. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. I rewound it, played it again. But this time, there was nothing, just static. The footage was gone. I felt sick. What the hell had I just watched? I barely slept that night. The next morning, I told my dad about the tape, but when we tried to play it again, it was blank. No static, no video, just an empty black screen. I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever was on that tape was real. But if it was real, then what did that mean about my grandfather? I couldn't stop thinking about the tape. Even as I helped my dad clear out the rest of my grandfather's house, my mind kept replaying what I had seen. My grandfather, tied to that chair, the masked figure, the knife, and then nothing. The way the footage just cut to black felt intentional, like someone didn't want me to see what happened next. But the part that disturbed me the most? My grandfather had been alive and well up until last summer. If that tape was real, if what I had seen actually happened, then how was he still around for all these years? It didn't make sense. That night after my dad went to sleep, I pulled out the tape again. I held it up to the light, turning it over in my hands. It looked normal, just a regular VHS tape, nothing unusual about it. But when I ran my fingers along the plastic, I felt something, a tiny, almost invisible scratch near the reel. I pressed my thumb against it, and the lights flickered. My heart jumped. I turned around, expecting to see my dad coming down the hall, but the house was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but then I felt it, this strange, heavy pressure in the air. Like the entire room had shifted somehow, like something was watching me. I swallowed hard, pushing down the growing unease in my chest, and turned back to the tape. If there was something hidden on it, I needed to find out. I grabbed my laptop, searching online for ways to recover lost VHS footage. Most of what I found was technical, stuff about magnetic tapes and signal degradation. But one post stood out. It was on some obscure forum buried deep in the search results. The title read, "If your VHS tape is missing footage, try this." The post was short. It talked about how some old tapes had hidden recordings that could only be accessed if played on the same VCR they were originally recorded on. If the footage was missing or corrupted, rewinding and fast-forwarding multiple times might trigger the lost content. It sounded ridiculous, but I was desperate. I went back to the living room, slid the tape into my grandfather's old player, and hit rewind. The machine whirred loudly, the gears clicking as the tape spun back to the beginning. My fingers hovered over the play button. I hesitated. Something inside me was screaming, "Don't do this." But I pressed play anyway. Static. And then, the same room, the same concrete walls, the same chair. But this time, it was empty. I leaned forward, my pulse racing. The camera was still, pointed at the chair like it was waiting for something to happen. The audio was just a faint crackling noise, like someone breathing through an old microphone. Then, movement. A shadow flickered across the screen. My stomach tightened. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but then the shadow grew darker, more defined. Someone, or something, was standing just outside the frame, watching. I held my breath. Slowly, the figure stepped forward. It wasn't my grandfather, and it wasn't the masked person from before. This figure was wrong. Its body was thin, unnaturally elongated, with limbs that seemed too long for its frame. Its face, it didn't have one, just smooth, pale skin stretching where its features should have been. It stood there completely still, facing the camera. And then, it turned its head, not like a normal person would. The motion was jerky, unnatural, like its neck was breaking in slow motion, and it was looking directly at me. The TV screen flickered, and then, it was in the room with me. I don't know how to explain it. 1 second it was on the screen, and the next, the air in the living room felt suffocating, like something else was there. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting and shifting even though nothing was moving. I could feel it, standing right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The TV screen went black, and then clear as day, a voice whispered directly into my ear, "You shouldn't have watched." I bolted. I don't even remember getting to my room, but suddenly I was there, my back pressed against the door, my chest rising and falling in rapid gasps. The house was silent again, No flickering lights, no shifting shadows. I told myself I imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I saw something, a handprint, right there on the TV screen. Not mine, and not my dad's. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't touch the tape again after that night. I barely even stepped foot in the living room. I tried to convince myself that it had been some kind of hallucination. Maybe I was sleep deprived. Maybe the dim lighting had messed with my vision. Maybe my mind had just filled in the blanks with fear. But every time I walked past the TV, I saw the faint outline of that handprint on the glass. And I knew it had been real, but I couldn't tell my dad. He already thought I was wasting time digging through Grandpa's old stuff instead of helping him clean out the house. If I told him I found a haunted VHS tape that showed some faceless thing staring at me through the screen, he'd probably think I lost my mind. So I kept quiet. For a while, things were normal, or at least I tried to pretend they were. I threw myself into helping my dad pack up boxes, sorting through the decades of junk my grandfather had collected. Every once in a while, I'd catch myself staring at the basement door, feeling this sick, gnawing pull in my gut, like something was waiting down there. But I ignored it. I told myself that as long as I didn't watch the tape again, I'd be fine. And I was, until the knocking started. It was the third night after I watched the tape. I was lying in bed staring at my phone, trying to distract myself with random videos. Anything to keep my mind off that thing I'd seen. Then, knock. Software. Gentle. Almost polite. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from the hallway. I waited, heart pounding. Maybe it was my dad. Maybe he got up for a glass of water or something, and he accidentally knocked against the wall on his way back to bed. But then it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps right outside my door. My skin went cold. Dad? My voice barely made a sound. Silence. I reached for my phone. Turning on the flashlight, the beam of light shook as I aimed it toward the door. Nothing. I held my breath. And then, knock, knock, knock. Louder this time. Harder, like whatever was on the other side was getting impatient. My stomach twisted. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to move, not to answer. But then something even worse happened. My phone screen went black, not like it died. The flashlight was still on, but the screen itself, everything just vanished. No apps, no notifications, just a dark, empty void. And then, the knocking stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, my phone was working again, like nothing had happened. No missed calls, no weird glitches. But when I checked the hallway outside my room, I noticed something small on the floor. A scrap of film tape, thin, black, curled at the edges, like it had been burned. And I knew exactly where it had come from. I should have thrown the VHS tape away. I knew that. But instead, I found myself sitting in the basement, staring at it. The old VCR sat in front of me, the TV's blank screen reflecting my pale, tense face. I could still feel the faint prickle of unease on the back of my neck. The same weight in the air that I had felt the last time I played it. But this time, I had to know. I had to see what was on the rest of the tape. I took a deep breath, and I pressed play. Static filled the screen. Then, the chair, the empty concrete room. I braced myself, waiting for the faceless figure to return. But something was different. The camera was shaking, unsteady, like whoever was holding it was moving, walking. The view shifted, turning toward a darkened doorway at the far end of the room. And then, a voice, low, whispering. I couldn't understand the words, but they made my skin crawl. The camera moved forward into the darkness, and suddenly the screen glitched. The footage jumped, warping and twisting, the colors bleeding together into this horrible, sickening distortion. When it stabilized again, the room was different. The chair was gone. The walls were cracked, covered in dark, smeared stains. And then I saw it, a mirror, standing against the far wall, reflecting the empty room. But something was wrong, because in the mirror there wasn't an empty room. There was a person standing there, facing the camera, facing me. My blood turned to ice. The figure was blurry at first, like a smudge on the glass, but then it moved, stepping closer and closer, until I saw its face, my own. But it wasn't me. The version of me in the mirror was grinning, not a normal grin, a twisted, unnatural smile, stretched too wide, teeth too sharp. And then it tilted its head, just like the faceless figure had. My stomach churned. I wanted to look away, to shut the TV off, but I couldn't move. The mirror me raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. A single burned handprint, a perfect match to the one on my TV. And then, in a voice that sounded exactly like mine, it whispered, "Let me out." The screen cut to black. The TV turned off on its own. And behind me, in the reflection of the dark screen, something moved. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of that basement, to never come back. But I just sat there, frozen, my breath locked in my throat. Something was behind me. I could see it in the reflection of the TV screen. A dark shape, tall, wrong, standing just behind my shoulder. And then it moved. A slow, deliberate tilt of the head, the same way the thing in the tape had tilted its head at me. A sick, icy shudder crawled up my spine. I forced myself to move. In one sharp motion, I slammed my hand against the VCR, jamming the eject button. The tape whirred. The screen flickered. And the second the VHS popped out, the reflection vanished. I didn't think. I just grabbed the tape and bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, my legs shaking so hard I nearly tripped. I didn't stop until I was in my room, door locked, every light turned on. Only then did I look down at the tape in my hands. Something had changed. The label, where it had once been blank, now had something scrawled on it. 4 words, "Let me out." My stomach twisted. I should have destroyed it. I should have snapped the tape in half, burned it, buried it, anything. But I didn't, because deep down, a horrible thought had already lodged itself into my brain. What if that wasn't the end of the tape? What if there was more? I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing in the reflection. My face, but wrong. Grinning, staring, waiting, and worse. I kept hearing things. Soft movements, floorboards creaking just outside my door, and the knocking, always at 3:33 a.m. The next morning I was pale, exhausted, barely able to think straight. My dad noticed. "You okay, kid?" He frowned over his coffee. I hesitated. Then, "Did Grandpa ever mention anything about a tape?" He blinked. "What?" I swallowed. "A VHS tape. I found it in the basement. Looked really old." For a second, I thought he was going to brush it off. But then his face changed. His whole expression went tight. His grip on the coffee mug stiffened. "You found one of them?" My stomach dropped. "One of them?" My dad exhaled sharply, setting his coffee down. "Jesus." He rubbed a hand over his face, looking suddenly exhausted. "Listen, I don't know much about it. Just that your grandfather, he had this thing about old tapes. Used to collect them. But some of them, I don't know, man. He wouldn't let anyone watch them." A cold feeling curled in my gut. "Did he ever say why?" "No." My dad shook his head. "But I remember once, when I was a kid, I tried to sneak one. Thought maybe it was some kind of weird horror movie. He lost his mind when he caught me. Said if I ever touched those tapes, I'd regret it." I swallowed hard. "He had a whole shelf of them," my dad muttered, more to himself now. "And when he got older, he started getting real paranoid. Said he was being watched, that something was trying to get out." I went cold. "What happened to the tapes?" My dad hesitated. Then, "He burned them." The floor felt like it had dropped out from under me. "All of them?" I whispered. "Yeah." A tight, humorless chuckle. "Whole damn collection. It was like an exorcism. He wouldn't even let anyone near the fireplace until they were nothing but ash." My grip on the table tightened. "Then why is there still one left?" The silence that followed was heavy. I don't know," my dad admitted finally. A sharp knock interrupted us. We both jumped, whipping our heads toward the front door. Someone was outside. Dad went to answer it. I followed, my skin prickling with unease. But when he pulled the door open, no one was there. Just an empty porch, a dead silent street. The morning air was still, eerily off, like something was watching us from the trees. And then my dad noticed it. Something on the doormat, a VHS tape, identical to the one in my room. My dad stared at it. I could see the way his hands clenched at his sides, the faint tension in his jaw. Then, very slowly, he bent down, picked it up. His face went pale, because there were words scrawled on the label. 4 words. Bring me back down. I couldn't breathe. I had 2 tapes now, and something told me that if I played the new one, I wouldn't be watching it alone. I didn't want to take the tape. Everything in my body screamed, don't touch it. Don't bring it inside. But my dad was already holding it, his face twisted in something like fear and confusion. This some kind of joke? His voice was tense. I swallowed hard. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was connected to the first tape, and whatever had happened in Grandpa's basement, whatever he tried to burn away, wasn't gone. It was still here, waiting, watching. Dad refused to play the tape. I don't want that thing in this house, he muttered, pacing the living room. I should throw it out, smash it. I wanted to agree. I really did. But some awful, gnawing part of me needed to know what was on it, because the first tape wasn't finished. I'd yanked it out before the end, and a sick, creeping feeling in my gut told me that was a mistake. Maybe we should just see what's on it, I said quietly. Dad froze. Then he turned to look at me like I'd lost my mind. No. He wasn't asking. He was telling me. I hesitated, gripping my arms. But no, and just like that, the conversation was over. Dad took the tape out to the shed, locked it in his old toolbox. I told myself that was the end of it. That night I realized how wrong I was. I woke up to a sound, a soft, static hiss. My heart nearly stopped, because it was coming from the basement. The TV, it was on. I sat up, every nerve in my body screaming. My room was completely dark except for the dim glow from under my door, faint and flickering, like a TV playing. I checked the clock, 3:33 a.m. A slow, icy shudder ran down my spine. And then, footsteps, soft, deliberate. Moving up the basement stairs, my breath locked in my throat. Someone was in the house. I should have grabbed my phone, should have woken my dad, should have done anything except what I actually did. I got up, I moved toward the door, and when I pressed my ear against it, I heard breathing, not mine, just on the other side, waiting. And then, the doorknob turned. I lunged back as the door creaked open, my pulse hammering in my skull. At first I saw nothing, just my dark, empty hallway, and then my gaze drifted down, to the floor, where a VHS tape sat, waiting. No label, no explanation, just there. My stomach twisted. I didn't touch it, didn't move. And then from somewhere down the hall, a voice, faint, wrong, familiar. It said my name. I stayed in my room until sunrise, didn't sleep, didn't move, just sat there staring at the tape on the floor, trying to convince myself I hadn't heard what I'd heard, that the voice hadn't sounded like me, but deep down I knew better. And when my dad woke up, the tape was gone. That morning I decided I needed to end this. I waited until my dad left for work, then grabbed the first tape, the one I'd found in the basement, and went back downstairs. The basement felt different now, heavier, like something was waiting for me. I swallowed hard, stepping toward the TV. My hands trembled as I shoved the tape into the VCR, hard hammering. The screen flickered, and then the tape continued, from where it had cut off before. The static faded, revealing the same dark basement from before, the same old TV, and the same figure standing in front of it. Only now it was closer. I felt my pulse stutter, because I could see it clearly now. It wasn't just a reflection, it was me, or something wearing my face. It grinned, and then, in that same warped voice, it spoke. Come back down. And the screen went black. I don't remember shutting off the TV. I don't remember running back upstairs. But the next thing I knew, I was in my room, shaking, heart trying to crawl out of my throat. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but I couldn't, because in the reflection of my bedroom window, for just a second, I saw it, standing right behind me, grinning. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, not with it here. I didn't know what it was, a ghost, a curse, something worse. But I knew one thing for sure, it wanted me. And if I didn't do something now, I might not get another chance. I grabbed my keys and ran. Didn't pack, didn't think, just got in my car and drove. I didn't even have a plan. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. But I knew I had to get as far away as possible. But then, my phone rang. I flinched so hard I nearly swerved off the road. The screen flashed. Dad. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady my breath before answering. Hello? Silence, then. Why did you leave? I nearly slammed the brakes, because that wasn't my dad's voice. It sounded like him, but wrong, stretched, distorted, like something wearing his voice. I gripped the wheel, knuckles white. Where's my dad? A pause, then, in a voice that was just barely off. Come back down. A violent, static hiss exploded from my phone speaker. I threw it onto the passenger seat, hard hammering. The call ended. And then, I heard breathing, not over the phone, from the back seat, right behind me. I didn't look. I just floored the gas. My pulse was a roaring thunder in my skull. But then, the engine cut off. The whole car died. I barely had time to react before the streetlights flickered out, plunging everything into total darkness. And in the silence, a voice, right next to my ear. Come back down. I don't remember what happened next. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I knew, I was home, back in my room, standing in front of my closet mirror. And in the reflection, I saw two of me, one standing in the mirror, one standing outside, smiling, grinning, and then it stepped out. I don't know how much time has passed. I don't know if I ever really left that basement. But something is wrong, because my dad, he doesn't look at me the same way anymore. He barely talks to me, and last night I heard him whispering on the phone. I don't think it's him.